March 17, 1943. Millbrook Hollow, Pennsylvania. Dr. Warren Albright Pritchard stood on the porch of Bertie Mae Kincaid's farmhouse and stared at her lifeless body through the screen door. The old woman lay in her bed, covered with a faded quilt, hands folded across her chest, face serene as though she'd simply drifted off to sleep. But Warren knew death. He'd seen enough of it in his 48 years, in field hospitals overseas during the Great War, in the influenza epidemic of 1918, right here in this forgotten valley where people still died from things that shouldn't kill anyone in 1943. Bertie had passed quietly, without struggle, just as she'd predicted she would. But what Warren discovered in her house 2 hours after signing the death certificate made him wish he'd never set foot in this God-forsaken hollow. In the corner of her parlor, behind a curtain made from flour sacks stitched together, stood an old steamer trunk. Inside it was a file box. Hundreds of index cards, covered in tight, meticulous handwriting. Names. Every resident of Millbrook Hollow. And beside each name, not diagnoses, not remedies, not recipes for tonics. Secrets. Terrible, shameful, devastating secrets that people had hidden from neighbors, from families, from themselves for decades. Warren pulled out a card at random, read 3 lines, and understood. If this became known, the community would tear itself apart within a single night. Warren Pritchard had never trusted Bertie Mae Kincaid. Not that he feared her the way many folks in the Hollow did, but something about the old woman had always triggered a deep unease in him. She was what people called a granny woman, an herbalist, midwife, and healer rolled into one. In Millbrook Hollow, like in hundreds of other isolated American communities, such women commanded more respect than licensed physicians. People came to Bertie when their babies wouldn't stop crying. They brought her their men twisted up with lumbago. She set broken bones, treated infections with poultices nobody else could make, cured barrenness with tinctures brewed from plants only she could identify in the surrounding mountains. She never took cash payment, only goods. Eggs, milk, flour, bacon, preserves. Enough to keep the old woman comfortable in her weathered farmhouse at the edge of the hollow, right next to the old cemetery. Warren had arrived in Millbrook Hollow in 1923, fresh from medical school and idealistic as hell. He'd served as a medic in France during the Great War, pulling wounded men from the trenches, performing amputations in field tents, stitching wounds in hospital trains that rattled through the French countryside. When the war ended, he thought the worst was behind him. But the Hollow had greeted him with a silence that wasn't peaceful. It was dead. The community was still recovering from the influenza epidemic that had killed nearly 1/3 of its population. Millbrook Hollow became a kingdom of widows, orphans, and the permanently scarred. Warren took the position of the only doctor for 20 miles, a small clinic in a converted general store, 2 examination tables, a medicine cabinet, and an oil lamp. The pay was terrible, the work endless, the respect minimal. Because right down the road was Bertie, and people went to her first. They'd first clashed in the autumn of 1924. A farmer brought Warren his daughter, about 7 years old, burning with fever and covered in a rash. Scarlet fever, Warren diagnosed. The child needed isolation and sulfa drugs. But the father took the girl away and carried her to Bertie instead. 3 days later, the child died. Warren went to see the old woman. He didn't yell, didn't accuse. He simply asked, quote, One Bertie sat on her porch, shelling beans into a wooden bowl. She looked up at him with eyes the color of winter frost. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, quote, underscore, underscore. Warren turned and walked away. From that day forward, they existed in parallel, like 2 different religions in the same small congregation. On the morning of March 17, 1943, Warren woke to knocking on his door. Standing on his porch was Noreen Fletcher, the postmistress who ran the mail service out of her front room. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 3 underscore, underscore. He dressed in silence, grabbed his medical bag, and walked through the hollow. March had come early that year. the last snow already melting to reveal black mud and dead grass. Millbrook Hollow was waking slowly. Smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere a rooster crowed late. A hound bayed from a distant porch. Bertie's house stood at the edge of the community, its back to the mountain forest, facing the graveyard. An old but solid structure, with a sagging porch and a chimney that listed slightly to the left. Warren pushed open the front door. Inside, it smelled of dried herbs, candle wax, and that peculiar scent that remains after a soul departs, the smell of absolute stillness. Bertie lay in her bed in the main room. Someone had covered her with a clean quilt, washed her face, combed her long white hair. Who had done this? Warren didn't know. Probably Noreen. He approached, pulled back the quilt, checked for a pulse at the carotid artery. A formality, of course. The old woman had been dead for at least 8 hours. Rigor mortis had already begun. No signs of violence. He examined her hands. No defensive wounds. Her face was calm. Natural death from old age, Warren concluded. She was 82 years old, by mountain standards practically biblical. He pulled out the death certificate from his bag, filled in the details, stamped it with his seal. Formalities complete. Now they just had to wait for her niece from Harrisburg, whom Noreen had already telegraphed, and they could hold the funeral. Warren meant to leave, but something made him linger. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps that old antagonism demanding he finally look behind the curtain of her performance. He walked through the house. The main room was clean, almost sparse. A Bible on the table, chairs worn smooth, a pot-bellied stove. None of the witchcraft paraphernalia he'd half expected. In the back room, her bedroom, stood a bed, a trunk, and an old wardrobe. Warren opened it. Clothing, shawls, nothing unusual. Then he noticed the curtain in the corner. He pulled it aside. Behind it sat another trunk, smaller, bound with metal straps. The lid wasn't locked. He opened the trunk. Inside were wooden boxes, the kind used for storing seeds. But these didn't contain seeds. Index cards, hundreds of them, meticulously arranged alphabetically. Warren pulled out the first stack. Letter A. Amos Bartholomew Ashford. Adelaide Ruth Brennan. He picked Amos's card, unfolded it. Bertie's cramped handwriting covered both sides. Amos Bartholomew Ashford, born 1891. Widower. 4 children. Secret. In 1932, during the worst of the Depression, killed his neighbor Ernest Talbot in a violent confrontation over a sack of potatoes. Buried the body in his cornfield under the scarecrow. That corner of the field has produced the best yield in the hollow ever since. Amos believes this is God's forgiveness, a sign of divine mercy. It isn't. Every night he wakes at 2:47 a.m., the exact time of the incident. Drinks to forget. His children think he's just a drunk. Warren slowly lowered the card back into the box. Amos Ashford was a quiet old man who did indeed have a drinking problem. Everyone thought him harmless, but he had blood on his hands. Warren pulled another card. Adelaide Brennan. Read it. Felt ice crawl up his spine. Adelaide, a devout churchgoer and organist, had in 1929 lost an infant under circumstances she'd never disclosed. The child was buried quickly, quietly, and Adelaide told everyone the baby had been stillborn. But Bertie's notes suggested something darker, a tragedy Adelaide had caused and could never undo. Her husband never learned the truth. Warren sank down onto his haunches beside the trunk. His hands trembled. He pulled out another stack. Letter B. Brennan, Buckley, Burwell. Read entry after entry. Adultery, theft, betrayal. One man had reported his own brother to federal agents as a draft dodger during the Great War, getting him imprisoned so he could take over the family farm. A woman had administered small doses of rat poison to her mother-in-law over many months, making the death appear natural. A father had struck his son repeatedly, causing permanent injury. but everyone believed the boy's damaged hearing came from a childhood infection. How had she learned these things? Warren sorted through cards, and with each new revelation the question grew louder. How had an old mountain herbalist who barely left her property compiled a dossier on every resident of Millbrook Hollow? Some secrets were ancient, predating the Great War. Others were fresh, dated from last month. Bertie knew who had cheated on their spouse and when. Who had stolen from the church collection plate? Who had written anonymous letters to authorities? Which prominent families had hidden shameful truths about their children's origins? She knew everything, and she'd written it all down. Warren reached letter quote 7. His hand froze over a card bearing his own name. Quote 8. He didn't pull it out. Not yet. Instead, he closed the trunk, dropped the curtain back into place, and walked out of the house. On the porch, Noreen was waiting. "Well, Dr. Pritchard, everything in order?" He nodded. "When's the niece arriving?" "Vera Kincaid? Got the telegram. Says she'll be here tomorrow evening. Train takes a while, then she's got to catch a ride up the mountain." "Fine. Body can be prepared. Funeral day after tomorrow." Noreen nodded and left to gather the women for the washing and dressing. Warren walked home, unable to shake what he'd seen. The file box, a trunk full of sins. Bertie had been collecting these secrets for over 30 years, since the early 1910s when she first started her practice as a healer. Why? Blackmail? But she'd never demanded money, never threatened anyone. Power? Perhaps. Knowledge of others' secrets was absolute power. People came to her for healing and left having surrendered a piece of their soul. During feverish confessions, in moments of weakness, in the vulnerability of childbirth, they talked. And she wrote it down. His house stood in the center of the hollow, next to his clinic. Inside it was cold. Warren lit the stove, put on a kettle, sat at his table and stared out the window. Outside, darkness was gathering. The community was settling in for the night, unaware that in the dead woman's house lay a bomb capable of obliterating Millbrook Hollow. What should he do? Burn the file box? That would be right. Secrets should die with Bertie. But burning them meant destroying evidence. Some of these entries concerned serious crimes, deaths that had never been investigated, people who had disappeared, everyone assuming they'd run off to the city, when actually they were buried somewhere in these mountains. If he burned the files, these crimes would go unpunished forever. But if he turned them over to the sheriff? Warren imagined a state police detective arriving from the county seat, interrogations beginning, old wounds reopening, families dissolving, neighbors refusing to speak to each other. The community wouldn't survive. It was barely holding on as it was, still recovering from the Depression, now with half its young men shipped off to fight in Europe and the Pacific. One more blow and Millbrook Hollow would become a ghost town that people visited only to tend graves. Third option, leave everything as it is. Hand the trunk over to the niece, Vera. Let her decide. But he didn't know Vera. He'd seen her once, maybe 6 years ago, when she'd come to visit her aunt. A young woman, early 30s, city-bred, wearing a fashionable coat and carrying herself with urban coldness. What would she do with the files? Sell them? Start blackmailing people? Or simply throw them away, not understanding their significance? Warren stood, poured himself coffee from the pot. It was strong, bitter, scalding. He drank and thought. Then he made his decision. He would return to Bertie's house tonight, read every card, every single one. He needed to know the truth about the community where he'd spent 20 years of his life. Then he'd decide what came next. At midnight, Warren left his house. The hollow was asleep. The moon hid behind clouds, and darkness hung thick and heavy. He walked through mud, listening to dogs barking in the distance. Bertie's house loomed as a dark shape against the forest. Warren pushed open the door. It wasn't locked. Nobody locked doors in Millbrook Hollow. Why bother? There was nothing worth stealing and nobody to steal from. Inside, he lit the oil lamp with matches from his pocket. The flame cast dancing shadows on the walls. He went to the back room, pulled aside the curtain, opened the trunk, began pulling out cards, started with A and read methodically. Every card, every secret. Hours passed. The lamp burned low. Warren's eyes ached, but he kept reading. By dawn, he'd finished. He sat on the floor, surrounded by cards, his mind reeling. Birdie had documented over 30 years of human darkness, 3 deaths that were clearly not accidents. Adultery, more than he could count. Theft from neighbors, from the church, from family. Betrayals that destroyed relationships, lies that children still believed about their parents. Every family in Millbrook Hollow carried rot at its core. And Birdie had known. For decades, she'd known. Warren stood, his knees creaking. He gathered the cards, returned them to their boxes, arranged the boxes in the trunk exactly as he'd found them. Then he sat down again and pulled out his own card. He'd been avoiding it all night. Now he couldn't delay any longer. He unfolded it, read Birdie's precise handwriting. ___quote _14___. Warren folded the card slowly. His hands weren't shaking. He felt strangely calm. Birdie had known. Of course she'd known. He'd told no one, but somehow, perhaps in a fever one winter when she'd treated him for pneumonia, perhaps during one of those late-night house calls when exhaustion loosened tongues, he must have spoken of it. Or she'd simply seen it in him. Birdie saw everything. He put the card back, closed the trunk, extinguished the lamp, walked out into the gray dawn. The hollow was waking. Roosters crowing, cattle lowing, normal sounds of normal life. But nothing was normal. Nothing had ever been normal here. Warren spent the day in a daze. He saw patients at the clinic, a child with an earache, an old man with gout, a woman suffering from anxiety about her son fighting in Italy. He treated them mechanically, prescribed medicines, offered reassurances he didn't believe. All the while, his mind churned. That evening, Vera Kincaid arrived. She came in a taxi from the train station, a tall woman in her 30s wearing a severe gray suit and carrying a single suitcase. Warren met her at Birdie's house. Noreen had prepared the body, dressed Birdie in her best black dress, laid her in a simple pine coffin in the parlor. Vera looked at her aunt's corpse with dry eyes. __quote_15___. She asked Warren. Not, how did she die? Not, will you tell me about her last days? Just how much? Warren gave her the figures. Coffin, plot, burial. Vera wrote a check from a Pittsburgh bank, Warren said. Vera said. Warren asked carefully. Warren felt his chest tighten. He said. Vera shrugged. Warren nodded. That night, after Vera returned to the boarding house in town, Warren went back to Birdie's house. He carried the trunk out to his truck, drove it home, and hid it in his cellar behind canning jars and coal bins. The next day, they buried Birdie Mae Kincaid in the cemetery she'd lived beside for 40 years. 15 people attended. The minister read Psalm 23. They lowered the coffin, threw dirt, went home. Vera left on the evening train. Warren never saw her again. For a week, Warren didn't touch the trunk. Then, one night, unable to sleep, he went down to the cellar and opened it, pulled out random cards, read them again, felt the weight of all that knowledge pressing on his skull. He should burn it, right now. Light a fire in the stove, feed the cards into it one by one, watch them turn to ash. But his hands wouldn't move. Because Birdie had been right. This wasn't just a collection of secrets. It was power. Absolute power over every person in Millbrook Hollow. If Warren burned these cards, he was powerless again. Just a doctor in a dying community. But if he kept them, if he learned what Birdie had known, he didn't finish the thought. closed the trunk, went back upstairs. But the seed was planted. Years passed. The war ended in 1945. Boys came home, some of them. Others stayed buried in French soil, Italian mud, Pacific islands nobody had heard of. Millbrook Hollow struggled on. The coal mines played out. Young people left for cities. The population dwindled. Warren's practice shrank. But he stayed. Where else would he go? And always, in the back of his mind, the trunk in the cellar. The secrets waiting. In 1951, Amos Ashford died in his sleep at age 60. His children wanted to sell the farm, but nobody would buy it. Word had gotten around that the land was unlucky. Warren knew why. He'd read Bertie's card. He knew about Ernest Talbot's body in the cornfield. And somehow, though he'd never spoken a word, people sensed it. The way Bertie had made them sense things. The farm stayed empty, gradually falling to ruin. In 1953, Adelaide Brennan's daughter, the one she'd raised after the tragedy, came to Warren. The girl was 22, engaged to be married, worried because her fiancé's family was asking questions about her family history. Did Dr. Pritchard remember anything unusual about her mother's past? Any lost siblings? Warren looked at the young woman's trusting face and lied. Quote, 25, he said. Quote, 26. He didn't tell her about the darker truth Bertie had recorded. Some truths were too destructive. But with each lie, Warren felt himself becoming Bertie, guardian of secrets, keeper of the Hollow's rotten heart. He understood now why she'd compiled the files. Not for blackmail, not even for power in the conventional sense. For control. If the secrets came out, the community would destroy itself. So she'd held them, locked away, hidden behind a flour sack curtain, far from sight, from sound, from truth. The years accumulated. 1955, 1960, 1965. Millbrook Hollow withered. The mines closed completely in 1958. By 1970, only 35 people remained. The church closed its doors. The general store shuttered. The school merged with a district 15 miles away. Warren continued working, though patients were scarce. He treated the elderly as they died off one by one. He buried them. Each grave dug in the cemetery next to Bertie's. In 1974, something happened that shook Warren to his core. A state police investigator showed up in the hollow. Someone had sent an anonymous tip about a Depression-era disappearance, suggesting a body might be buried in what used to be the Ashford property. The investigator obtained permission to excavate and started digging in the old cornfield. 3 days later, they found human remains. Forensics confirmed. Homicide. Early 1930s, based on artifacts found with the body. An investigation opened. Warren sat in his house and watched the investigator interview the handful of remaining old-timers. Who could have sent the tip? Amos was dead. Bertie was dead. Warren had told no one. But someone knew. Perhaps Amos had confessed on his deathbed to a priest or a relative. Perhaps that person told another. A chain. An endless chain of sins passing down through whispers and deathbed confessions. The investigation stalled after 6 weeks. The killer was dead, material witnesses were gone, and without more evidence, the case was closed as a historical cold case. But before leaving, the investigator said something to Warren that haunted him. "Strange community you got here, Doctor. Everyone's so closed off. Like they're all protecting something." Warren replied, "Not protecting, afraid." "Of what?" the investigator asked. Warren looked at him. Each other. After that, Warren tried to leave. He wrote to the county medical board requesting a transfer anywhere else. They wrote back, "Nowhere to send you. Rural doctors are desperately scarce. Young physicians won't accept positions in dying towns. You're needed where you are. Stay." He stayed. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the population continued to shrink. By 1985, only 7 people remained in Millbrook Hollow. 7 elderly individuals clinging to their homes, their gardens, their cemetery plots. The county closed Warren's clinic officially in 1986. He retired, receiving a small pension. He could have left then, sold his house, moved to Harrisburg or Pittsburgh, lived out his final years in comfort. But he didn't. Because he understood finally what had kept Bertie here all those decades. He was part of this place. Like her. Like everyone who knew the secrets. To leave would be to abandon his post, and if he abandoned it, what would happen to the knowledge he guarded? In 1991, the last resident besides Warren died. A woman named Constance Fletcher, 94 years old, who had outlived her husband, all her children, and most of her grandchildren. Warren buried her himself, as he'd buried so many others. Dug the grave with a shovel, his 70-year-old back aching with each scoop of earth. Lowered the coffin with ropes. Filled the grave. Said a prayer. Then, he returned to his empty house. Millbrook Hollow was dead. Buildings stood empty, their windows like blind eyes. Streets were overgrown with weeds and saplings. Porches sagged, roofs caved in. Only Warren's house and the cemetery remained maintained. He lived alone, talking to ghosts, tending his small garden, reading books by lamplight because the electricity had been shut off years ago. Sometimes he went down to the cellar and opened the trunk, read through the cards, reminded himself of what he guarded. On cold nights, he wondered if he'd made the right choice. Should he have burned the files back in 1943? Let the secrets die with Bertie? Or was he right to preserve them, to become what she had been, the silent keeper of Millbrook Hollow's sins? He never found an answer. In August 2001, at the age of 106, Warren Albright Pritchard died in his house. He was sitting in his chair by the window, looking out at the overgrown street, when his heart simply stopped. They found him 4 days later when a real estate surveyor came to assess the land for potential development. The trunk was still in the cellar. The surveyor, not understanding what he'd found, donated it to the County Historical Society as __quote _ 31 __. The cards were cataloged, boxed, and stored in a climate-controlled basement where nobody would ever read them. They buried Warren in Millbrook Hollow Cemetery, next to Bertie Mae Kincaid's grave. The surveyor and a county official were the only attendees. No service, no eulogy, just a coffin lowered into earth, a temporary marker placed, and 2 men driving away. Within 2 years, Millbrook Hollow disappeared completely. A development company purchased all the land, demolished every remaining structure, and built a cluster of vacation homes marketed to wealthy Pittsburgh families looking for mountain retreats. The new residents knew nothing of the old community. They didn't know about the secrets, the sins, the decades of darkness that had accumulated here. They just saw beautiful mountain views and clean air. Only the cemetery remained, by law protected from development. It was fenced, maintained by county funds, visited occasionally by genealogists and historians. Most of the names on the stones meant nothing to anyone anymore. But 2 graves near the center of the cemetery stood side by side. Bertie Mae Kincaid, 1861 to 1943, and Warren Albright Pritchard, 1895 to 2001. The healer and the doctor, the keeper of secrets and her successor. Local teenagers sometimes came to the cemetery at night, daring each other to walk among the graves. They claimed they heard voices, whispers carried on the wind. Some said it was just the trees rustling. Others swore they heard actual words, conversations held in hushed tones, as if the dead were finally telling each other the truths they'd hidden in life. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was wind. Maybe it was something else entirely. Because secrets are strange things. They don't really die. They transform. They become stories, legends, whispers passed from one person to another. The specific details fade, but the shape remains. The knowledge that something dark happened here, that people carried terrible weights, that a community destroyed itself not through poverty or disaster, but through the accumulated burden of hidden truths. The trunk in the County Historical Society basement sits there still. Occasionally, a researcher pulls it out, reads a few cards, finds them too personal and disturbing, and boxes them up again. The names mean nothing now. Amos Ashford, Adelaide Brennan, all the others, they're just words on paper, entries in an old woman's obsessive catalog. The crimes, the betrayals, the sins, they're history, ancient history, irrelevant to the present. But that's the thing about secrets. You can bury them. You can lock them away. You can tell yourself they're dead and gone. But they're not. They're seeds. Plant them deep enough and they'll stay dormant for years, decades, even generations. But eventually, given the right conditions, a curious researcher, a bored teenager exploring their family tree, a journalist looking for a story, they germinate. They grow. They break through the soil and reach toward light. And when they do, they bear fruit. Strange, bitter fruit that tastes of old guilt and forgotten sins. The kind of fruit that reminds you that the past is never really past, that the things we hide don't disappear. They wait, patient and persistent, until someone, somewhere, someday, finds them. Millbrook Hollow is gone. The houses, the store, the church, the clinic, all erased. The people who lived there are dead. Their children scattered to cities across America, their grandchildren probably not even knowing the hollow ever existed. But the secrets remain. In that trunk, in those cards, in the earth of that cemetery where Bertie and Warren lie side by side, having taken the same vow, to keep, to guard, to protect the community from the truth about itself. They failed, of course. Everyone fails eventually, because truth is patient. Truth is inevitable. You can delay it, divert it, hide from it, but you can't stop it. Bertie knew this. That's why she kept the files. Not to use them, but to control when and how the truth would emerge. She believed she could manage revelation, could meter it out in doses small enough not to kill. Warren learned this too late. By the time he understood that secrets demand constant vigilance, constant management, constant fear, he was already too deep, already complicit, already transformed from the idealistic young doctor who'd arrived in 1923 into something else, a guardian, a keeper, a man defined not by what he revealed, but by what he concealed. In the end, both of them became prisoners of what they knew. Bertie died in her house at the edge of a cemetery, alone. Warren died in his house at the center of a ghost town, even more alone. Both of them sacrificed normal lives, families, happiness, for the burden of keeping secrets that weren't even their own. Was it worth it? Did their silence save Millbrook Hollow? Or did their silence kill it? These are the questions that haunt the empty space where the hollow once stood. Because the truth is, the community died anyway. Not in a single catastrophic revelation, not in violence or scandal, but slowly, through attrition, through economic decline, through the simple fact that young people left and never came back. The secrets that Bertie and Warren guarded so carefully didn't explode and destroy the hollow. They just rotted, poisoned the soil, made the place unlivable in ways nobody could quite articulate. People left because something felt wrong, because the weight of all those hidden things, all those unspoken truths, created an atmosphere of oppression that drove them away. They didn't know why they couldn't breathe in Millbrook Hollow. They just knew they had to leave. And they did, one by one, until only the guardians remained, clutching their files, protecting a community that no longer existed. That's the real tragedy. Not the crimes themselves, not even the secrets. The tragedy is that Bertie and Warren devoted their lives to protecting something that was already dying. They thought silence would save it. Instead, silence killed it. Slowly, quietly, inevitably. Now there's nothing left but graves and memories and a trunk full of cards and a basement that nobody visits. The secrets won. Not because they were revealed, but because they were kept. Because the energy it took to maintain them, the constant vigilance, the endless fear, the weight of knowledge, it consumed everything. It consumed Bertie. It consumed Warren. It consumed Millbrook Hollow itself. And somewhere, in that cemetery surrounded by vacation homes, where wealthy families grill steaks and children play on swing sets, Bertie Mae Kincaid and Warren Albright Pritchard lie in the earth. Keepers of secrets, guardians of nothing. Their bones mingling with the soil, their stories reduced to dates on stones, their life's work archived and forgotten in a county basement. But on certain nights, when the wind moves through the cemetery just right, some say you can still hear them. Not voices exactly, more like whispers. The sound of two people who spent their lives listening to confessions, finally confessing to each other. Finally telling the truth about what they did, what they knew, what they failed to prevent. Maybe it's real. Maybe it's not. But the locals who live in those vacation homes, they avoid the cemetery after dark. They tell their children not to play there. They don't know why exactly. They just know something feels wrong. Something lingers, some weight, some presence, some reminder that this land remembers what happened here. That secrets, once planted, never fully die. They just wait, dormant, patient, until someone comes along and waters them with curiosity. And then they grow again, fresh and terrible, exactly as they were before. That's the real curse of Millbrook Hollow. Not that it died, not that it was forgotten, but that its secrets remain, waiting to be found. Waiting for the next guardian, the next keeper, the next person foolish enough to think they can hold back the truth forever. Because you can't. Nobody can. Not Bertie, not Warren, not anyone. The truth always finds a way. Through death, through time, through the cracks in silence. It seeps out. It spreads. It grows. And eventually, it consumes everything. Just like it consumed them. Just like it consumed Millbrook Hollow. The only question is, who will find those cards next? Who will open that trunk and read those secrets? And what will they do with what they learn? Will they have the wisdom to burn them? Or will they make the same mistake Bertie and Warren made, thinking they can guard them, control them, manage the revelation? Time will tell. Time always tells. Because time is the one thing secrets can't escape. They can hide from people, from justice, from consequence, but they can't hide from time. Time erodes everything. Time exposes everything. Time takes what we bury and brings it back to light. And in that cemetery, surrounded by new homes and new families who know nothing of what came before, two graves sit side by side, waiting. The healer and the doctor, the keeper and the kept. Their secret now the same as all the others they guarded, hidden, forgotten, but not gone, never gone. Just waiting for someone to ask the right questions, to dig in the right places, to find what was meant to stay lost forever. Because nothing stays lost forever. That's what Bertie knew. That's what Warren learned. That's what Millbrook Hollow proved. The truth is like water. It always finds a way. Through cracks, through crevices, through the smallest openings. It flows. It spreads. It cannot be contained. And when it finally breaks free, it washes everything away. Everything except the memory. And the graves. Always the graves. Silent witnesses to what was. What is. What always will be. The endless cycle of secrets and revelations, silence and truth, burial and resurrection. Millbrook Hollow is gone, But its lesson remains, written in stone, whispered on wind, waiting in archives. The lesson that secrets don't protect us, they imprison us. And the only way to be free is to speak them, to bring them into light, to let them die properly, in truth, rather than letting them fester in darkness. But who has that courage? Who can bear that cost? Bertie couldn't. Warren couldn't. The entire community of Millbrook Hollow couldn't. And so they all died, one by one, carrying their burdens to graves where the weight finally lifted. Too late. Always too late. The end comes for everyone, for communities, for keepers, for secrets themselves. But the question lingers, hanging over those two graves like morning mist. What comes after? When the keepers are gone and the secrets remain, what then? Do they die at last? Or do they simply wait for the next person to find them and start the cycle again? Nobody knows. But in that cemetery, on quiet nights, some swear they can hear the answer. Whispered between two stones, carried on wind from grave to grave, the sound of the dead, finally telling each other the truth. Too late to save anyone, but not too late to warn them. Listen, the whispers say. Learn. Don't make our mistake. Don't keep what should be spoken. Don't guard what should be released. Don't sacrifice your life for secrets that will outlive you anyway. But nobody listens. They never do. And so the cycle continues. In different places, with different people, with different secrets, but always the same pattern, always the same weight, always the same ending. Millbrook Hollow is gone, but it will happen again. Somewhere. To someone. And when it does, 2 more graves will be dug side by side. 2 more keepers will be buried. 2 more lives will be consumed by the weight of what they knew and could not speak. And the truth will wait, patient as always, inevitable as always, ready to begin again.